blade shattered against the Mamluk's shield, the steel breaking cleanly in two, leaving me with nothing but a useless hilt in my hand and 3 warriors advancing with scimitars raised. I stood on the blood-soaked sand outside Damascus, the remnants of our raiding party scattered or dead around me, and I understood with terrible clarity that I had no weapon, no hope of survival, no defense, except the prayer that rose unbidden to my lips. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. The words came automatically, learned through 20 years of devotions, spoken at lauds and vespers in Compline, and as the first warrior lunged toward me, I did not try to run or find another weapon or even raise my arms to defend myself. I simply stood there, prayer falling from my mouth like water from a spring, and I waited for the death that seemed inevitable. The scimitar came at my throat and I closed my eyes, still praying, still speaking words to a God I had served faithfully, but had never truly tested like this, had never asked to intervene directly, had never demanded proof of his presence beyond the comfort of ritual and the certainty of doctrine. And the blade stopped. I opened my eyes to find the warrior frozen mid-strike, his weapon trembling a hand's breadth from my neck, his face contorted with effort, as though he fought against some invisible force that held him immobile. The other 2 warriors had stopped as well, staring at their companion with expressions that moved from confusion to fear. I did not understand what was happening, could not explain why death had not fallen, why prayer seemed to have accomplished what my broken sword could not. The moment held for what felt like an eternity, me standing defenseless, still speaking prayers though my voice had dropped to a whisper, the 3 warriors frozen in positions of attack that never completed. Then the first warrior lowered his blade, stepped back, spoke something in Arabic I did not comprehend. The 3 of them exchanged glances, made signs against evil, and retreated rapidly across the sand, leaving me alive and alone amid the bodies of my fallen brothers. I sank to my knees in the blood-stained dust, my useless sword hilt still gripped in my shaking hand, and I wept because I did not know whether what had just occurred was miracle or madness, divine intervention or simple unexplainable chance. My name is Brother Matthieu of Lyon, and I joined the order at 18 with a faith so pure and certain it seemed to illuminate everything around me. I was the only son of a wealthy merchant, educated by monks, raised on stories of saints and martyrs, taught from earliest childhood that God was real and present and active in the world, that prayer was not merely words spoken into emptiness, but communication with the divine who heard and answered and intervened in human affairs. I believed this with absolute conviction, never questioned it, never doubted even for a moment that the God I prayed to was listening, was caring, was involved in the smallest details of his creation. When I announced my intention to join the temple, my father wept with joy. My mother held me and told me she had always known I was meant for holy service, and within a month I was on the road to Paris where I would begin my training as a warrior monk. I took to the discipline immediately, loved the rhythm of prayers marking each day, the physical rigor of combat training balanced by spiritual exercises, the sense that I was part of something larger and more meaningful than any individual life could be. I served my novitiate without incident, proved myself capable with weapons and horse, demonstrated the obedience and devotion the order required. I took my final vows on a spring morning, kneeling before the master as he laid the white mantle across my shoulders, and I spoke my promises with a heart so full of faith I thought it might burst. Poverty, chastity, obedience, eternal service to the defensive pilgrims in the Holy Land. 6 weeks later I sailed for Outremer, landing in Acre on a summer afternoon so hot the air itself seemed to shimmer, and I was assigned to the garrison at a small fortress in the desert south of Damascus. My duties were straightforward: patrol the roads, escort pilgrims, stand watch on the walls, engage Saracen raiders when they threatened our territory. It was hard service but not unbearable, dangerous but not suicidal, and I settled into the routines with the same devotion I had brought to my training. I prayed the hours faithfully, attended Mass whenever a priest was available, maintained my equipment with care, and I believed with unshaken certainty that God was with me, that my service was pleasing to Him, that He would protect me as I protected those who journeyed to the holy sites. For 3 years I served without questioning my faith or the assumptions that undergirded it. I fought when fighting was required, killed when killing was necessary, told myself that I was doing God's work in defending pilgrims and Christian holdings. I saw brothers die, in combat, from fever, from infected wounds, and I prayed for their souls and believed that God had called them home, that their deaths had meaning in some larger plan I could not fully comprehend. My faith remained simple, untroubled by the complexities that seemed to plague other brothers. The questions about whether God truly cared about our small struggles, whether our violence served him or merely served ourselves dressed in holy language. I did not ask such questions because the answers seemed obvious to me. Of course God cared. Of course our service mattered. Of course prayer was communication with a divine presence that heard and answered and guided. And then came the raid on the Saracen caravan. The ambush that went wrong. The moment when my sword shattered and I stood defenseless with nothing but prayer between me and death. And everything I believed was tested in a way I could never have anticipated. We had been 15 knights and 30 sergeants, tasked with disrupting supply lines running from Damascus to Saracen forces besieging a Christian fortress to the south. We struck at dawn expecting minimal resistance, planning to scatter the caravan guards and destroy the supplies before reinforcements could arrive. But we had been betrayed, or our intelligence was faulty, because the caravan was actually a full military column. 200 warriors well armed and prepared for exactly this kind of attack. They turned on us with devastating efficiency, and what should have been a quick raid became a desperate running battle across the desert. Brothers fell around me. Sergeants were cut down as they tried to retreat, and within an hour our force was scattered, small groups of survivors trying to fight their way clear of an enemy that vastly outnumbered us. I found myself with 3 other knights, separated from the main body, pursued by a dozen Mamluk warriors who wanted our heads as trophies. We fought them as we retreated, killed several, but they kept coming, kept pressing, and one by one my companions fell until I alone remained, still running, still fighting, still believing that somehow I would survive because God would not let me die in this forgotten corner of the desert. The end came at a dried riverbed where the sand was soft and running became impossible. I turned to face my pursuers, now reduced to 3 but still more than enough to kill one exhausted knight, and I raised my sword to meet their charge. The first Mamluk came at me with his scimitar high, and I parried with all the strength I had left, felt the impact shudder up my arm, heard the terrible sound of steel breaking as my blade shattered from the force of the blow. I stood there holding a useless hilt, no other weapon within reach. No hope of outrunning warriors whose horses were fresh while I stood on foot in deep sand. This was death, I understood. This was the end of my service, the conclusion of my story. And in that moment of understanding, prayer was all I had left, not as a weapon, not as a strategy, but simply as what I was, what I had always been, a man who spoke to God because speaking to God was the most fundamental thing about me. I prayed because I could not help praying, because prayer was as natural as breathing, because even facing death I could not conceive of doing anything else. And the warriors stopped, held frozen by something I could not see or understand. And then they fled. And I was alive for reasons I could not begin to explain. The walk back to our fortress took 2 days. 2 days during which I had nothing to do but think about what had happened, to try to make sense of an event that seemed to defy rational explanation. Had God intervened directly, stopping those warriors through some miraculous exertion of power? Or had something else occurred, some trick of light or heat, some coincidence that looked like miracle but was merely chance? I could not say. All I knew was that I had stood defenseless with nothing but prayer, and I had survived when by all logic I should have died. When I finally staggered through the fortress gates, half dead from thirst and exhaustion, Brother Commander Arnaud listened to my account with an expression that moved from skepticism to something like awe. "You stood before 3 Mamluk warriors with no weapon, and they simply left you alive?" he asked, as though trying to find the flaw in my story. I nodded. "I was praying," I said. And even as I spoke the words, they sounded absurd, as though prayer could stop swords, as though speaking to God could turn away death. I had nothing else, so I prayed, and they stopped, and then they ran. Arnaud was quiet for a long time, then said, "Perhaps you have been given a gift, Brother Matthieu, or perhaps you have been tested and found faithful. Either way, you have discovered something most of us never learn, that sometimes prayer is not preparation for action, but action itself." They gave me a new sword, fine Damascus steel captured in an earlier raid, and I returned to my duties expecting that life would continue as before, that the incident in the desert would become simply a story I told, an unexplained moment that I would eventually rationalize or forget. But I found that I could not forget, could not dismiss what had happened as mere chance or coincidence. Something had changed in me during those moments when I stood defenseless and prayed and lived. My relationship with prayer transformed from routine into something urgent, vital, a connection to God that felt more real than my connection to the physical world around me. I began to pray constantly, not just at the appointed hours, but throughout the day, speaking to God while I worked, while I trained, while I stood watch on the walls. My brothers noticed the change, some with approval, others with concern that I was becoming unbalanced, too focused on spiritual matters at the expense of practical readiness. Brother Arnaud called me to his chambers a month after my return and asked bluntly, "Are you still capable of fighting, Matthieu? Or has your experience made you too holy for the work we do here?" I assured him I could fight, and I meant it. But I also knew something had shifted, that I no longer trusted primarily in weapons but in something less tangible, less reliable by worldly standards but more real to me than steel or strength. The test came 3 months later when our fortress was attacked by raiders, 50 horsemen striking at dawn, attempting to breach our gates before we could fully respond. I stood on the wall with my new sword in hand, and when the first warrior climbed into view, I moved to strike him down, moved to do what I had been trained to do. But as my blade descended, I felt something stop me. Not an external force, but an internal conviction so strong it paralyzed my arm mid-swing. A voice inside me, whether God's voice or simply my own thoughts I could not say, commanded me to lower my weapon, to trust in prayer rather than steel. Every instinct of training and survival screamed at me to ignore this conviction, to kill the enemy before he killed me, but I could not disobey what felt like direct instruction from the divine. I lowered my sword and I began to pray aloud, speaking the paternoster while the warrior before me raised his own blade, while my brothers shouted at me to fight, while death approached for the second time because I chose prayer over violence. And again, impossibly, the enemy warrior stopped. His blade hung in the air between us, his eyes wide with something I could only describe as terror. And then he was scrambling back down the ladder, shouting to his companions in Arabic, pointing at me with a hand that shook visibly. The raiders broke off their attack minutes later, fleeing back into the desert without achieving any of their objectives, and I stood on the wall, still praying, still holding my unused sword, surrounded by brothers who stared at me with expressions ranging from wonder to suspicion. Brother Arnaud found me there an hour later, and his face was harder than I had ever seen it. "What you did was either the greatest act of faith I have witnessed or the most dangerous delusion that has ever infected this garrison," he said without preamble. "You refused to fight, Brother Matthieu. You stood on the wall with a sword in your hand and you chose prayer instead of combat. If that warrior had not fled, you would be dead, and worse, your failure to defend your post might have cost us the wall. I need to know. Was what you did obedience to God or simple madness?" I had no good answer for him. I knew only that I had felt compelled to pray, that fighting had seemed wrong in a way I could not articulate, and that somehow prayer had accomplished what combat would have achieved. "I believe God protected me," I said, hearing how weak the words sounded. "I believe he wanted me to trust him rather than my own strength." Arnaud's expression did not soften. "Faith is admirable, Brother Matthieu, but we are warriors, and warfare requires weapons. I cannot have a knight who refuses to fight standing on these walls. You will be reassigned to duties that do not involve combat until we determine whether what possesses you is divine inspiration or dangerous delusion." They sent me to work in the scriptorium, copying texts and keeping records, work that kept me away from the walls and the training yard, away from situations where my refusal to fight might endanger others. I accepted the reassignment without protest, spent my days in silence and prayer, trying to understand what was happening to me, why I felt this growing conviction that weapons were not the path God wanted me to walk, that prayer was not merely supplement to combat, but replacement for it. Other brothers avoided me, uncomfortable with what I represented, uncertain whether I was holy or mad. Only Brother Thomas, the fortress chaplain, sought me out, sitting with me in the scriptorium late one evening and asking the question everyone wanted answered. Do you truly believe God has called you to abandon weapons and rely solely on prayer? Do you understand what you are claiming? That the divine will intervene physically to protect you? That your words have power to stop swords and turn away death? This is not merely faith, Matthieu. This is claiming access to miracles, to supernatural power that most of us never witness in our entire lives. I thought about his question carefully before answering. I do not claim to understand what is happening to me, I finally said. I know only that twice I have stood defenseless with nothing but prayer, and twice I have survived when by all logic I should have died. I know that when I hold a sword now, when I prepare to strike an enemy, I feel a conviction so strong it might as well be God's voice telling me to trust Him instead of trusting steel. I cannot explain it. I cannot prove it is real rather than delusion. But I cannot ignore it. Cannot pretend I do not feel what I feel. Brother Thomas was quiet for a long time, then spoke with unexpected gentleness. The Church teaches that the age of miracles has not ended, that God still acts in the world, still intervenes to protect His faithful servants. But the Church also teaches discernment, teaches us to test what we believe are divine inspirations against Scripture and tradition and reason. What you describe could be genuine calling from God, or it could be pride dressed in holy language, the belief that you are somehow more faithful than other warriors, more deserving of divine protection. How do you know which it is? I had no answer for him because I had asked myself the same question 1,000 times, had wondered whether my conviction was genuine faith or dangerous arrogance, whether God was truly speaking to me, or whether I had simply convinced myself that my survival was proof of divine favor. I do not know, I admitted. I only know that I cannot return to fighting as I once did, cannot trust in weapons when I feel called to trust in prayer alone. If that makes me mad, if that makes me useless to the order, then send me away. But I cannot be other than what I have become. The decision about my future was taken from our small fortress and elevated to the Grand Master himself, who came to visit our garrison 3 months after the incident on the wall. He summoned me to private audience, a rare honor for a simple night, and when I stood before him, I saw in his weathered face not judgment, but genuine curiosity. I have read the reports from Brother Arnaud, he said. I have heard testimony from those who witnessed what happened in the desert and on the wall. You claim that God has called you to set aside weapons and fight with prayer alone. That is either the most profound faith I have encountered or the most dangerous delusion. I need to know which before I decide what to do with you. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. Tell me truly, Brother Matthieu, do you believe God will protect you no matter what danger you face? Do you believe prayer can stop swords and turn away death every time and every circumstance? Or do you simply trust that God's will shall be done, whether that means your protection or your martyrdom? The question cut to the heart of what I had been struggling to understand about myself. Did I believe in guaranteed protection, in miracle on demand? Or did I believe in something more subtle, that prayer was the truest service I could offer, and that outcomes were in God's hands rather than mine? I do not know if God will protect me every time, I answered slowly. I know only that I am called to pray rather than fight, to trust Him rather than trust weapons. If that trust leads to my death, then I will die praying, and I will consider that a better end than living while betraying what I believe He has asked of me. This is not about expecting miracles, Grandmaster. This is about obedience to what I believe is divine calling, even when that calling makes no practical sense, even when it seems like madness to everyone around me. The Grand Master studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You will be given a chance to prove whether your calling is genuine, he said. There is a village 3 days north of here where pilgrims gather before making the final approach to Jerusalem. The village has been repeatedly attacked by raiders, and we have not had resources to provide permanent protection. You will go there alone, Brother Matthieu. You will protect those pilgrims using whatever means you believe God has called you to use. If you survive 6 months, if the pilgrims are protected, if your prayer proves as effective as other men's swords, then I will accept that God has indeed given you a unique calling. If you fail, if you die, if the pilgrims are slaughtered because you chose prayer over weapons, well, then we will have our answer about whether your faith was genuine or simply delusion. I arrived at the village of Bethphage on a winter morning, carrying nothing but my rosary and the small book of Psalms I had been given when I took my vows. I wore no armor, carried no sword, presented myself to the village elders as a Templar knight sent to provide protection, though I looked nothing like any warrior they had ever seen. They received me with obvious skepticism. How could one unarmed man protect them when armed knights had failed? But they were desperate enough to accept any help, even help that seemed as insubstantial as prayer. I established my routine immediately. I walked the perimeter of the village at dawn and dusk, praying aloud, speaking the Psalms and the Paternoster and the Ave Maria in continuous cycle. I sat in the village square during the day, visible to any who approached, still praying, still speaking words to God as though he were present and listening and capable of action. The villagers thought me mad at first. Some pitied me, others mocked me. Children threw stones until their parents stopped them. But I continued day after day, week after week, speaking prayers that became as natural as breathing, trusting that God heard even when I saw no evidence of his attention. The raiders came on a moonless night 6 weeks after my arrival. A dozen men on horseback expecting easy plunder from a village defended only by farmers, and an insane knight who carried no weapons. I heard them approaching, heard the thunder of hooves, and I walked out to meet them in the center of the road leading into the village. I carried no torch, no weapon, nothing but my rosary wound around my hand. They saw me standing there and they laughed, called out mockery in Arabic, raised their weapons to cut me down as they passed. And I began to pray, not quietly but in a voice that carried across the night, speaking the words of Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him will I trust. The laughter died. The horses began to shy, to rear, refusing to advance despite their riders' commands. I continued praying, louder now, my voice rising above the confused shouts of the raiders. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. The horses would not advance. The raiders beat them, spurred them, shouted curses, but the animals refused to move forward, as though some invisible barrier stood between them and the village, between them and the praying man who blocked their path. I stood there speaking scripture, feeling power I did not understand flowing through the words, feeling certainty that God heard and responded and acted through my prayer in ways that transcended natural law. After 10 minutes, the raiders gave up, turned their frightened horses, fled back into the darkness from which they had come. I remained in the road until dawn, still praying, thanking God for protection I could not explain but could not deny. The villagers found me there when the sun rose, and their skepticism transformed into something like awe. The mad knight who carried no weapons had turned away raiders through prayer alone. Perhaps he was not mad after all. Perhaps God truly did hear and answer and protect those who trusted him completely. The raiders returned twice more over the following months, and twice more I met them with nothing but prayer, and twice more they fled without touching the village or its people. Word spread through the region of the Templar knight who fought with words instead of weapons, who stood defenseless against armed men and watched them turn away as though struck by invisible force. Pilgrims began to seek me out, to ask for prayers, to request that I accompany them on the final dangerous miles to Jerusalem. I agreed when I could, walked with them speaking prayers continuously, and not once did we face violence that prayer could not turn aside. I did not understand how this was possible, could not explain the mechanism by which spoken words influenced physical reality. But I could not deny what I witnessed repeatedly, that prayer offered in faith had power to protect, to influence, to change outcomes in ways that defied natural explanation. My 6 months became a year, then 2 years, and I remained at Bethphage not because the Grand Master required it, but because pilgrims needed protection. I alone seemed able to provide. Brother Thomas came to visit me in my 3rd year at the village, and we sat together in the small room I occupied, and he asked the question that had troubled him since our first conversation about my calling. Have you never doubted, Matthieu? Have you never wondered whether what protects you is God's intervention or simply fear in the hearts of men who believe you possess supernatural power? How do you maintain faith that this is genuine rather than elaborate coincidence? I thought about his question, about the dozens of times I had stood before armed men with nothing but prayer, about the consistent pattern of protection that seemed too regular to be mere chance yet too strange to be easily explained. I have doubted, I admitted. Every time I walk out to meet raiders, every time I stand defenseless, there is a moment when I wonder whether this time will be different, whether this time prayer will fail, and I will die proving nothing except my own delusion. But then I pray, and I feel something. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, but a presence, a certainty that I am not alone, that God hears and responds and acts. I cannot prove this to you. I cannot demonstrate it in any way that would satisfy someone who has not experienced it. But for me, the evidence is sufficient. Prayer works, Thomas. Not because I am holy or special, but because God is real and present and willing to act when we trust Him completely. I am an old man now, approaching 60, still living in Bethphage, though I am no longer the only protection the village has. The Order has assigned a small garrison here, knights who fight with conventional weapons while I continue my work of prayer. I have never returned to carrying a sword, never resumed the conventional warfare I practiced in my youth. Young knights sometimes come to see me, curious about the brother who claims to fight with prayer alone, skeptical of stories they have heard, wanting to test whether what I do is real or simply legend, grown in the telling. I tell them my story, show them the village that has not been successfully raided in 20 years, introduce them to pilgrims who have walked to Jerusalem under my protection without facing violence. Some believe, some remain skeptical. And I do not blame those who doubt, because what I do makes no sense by any conventional standard, violates every principle of military strategy, depends on a God who most people believe helps those who help themselves, rather than those who stand defenseless trusting in divine protection. But I know what I have experienced, know what I have witnessed, know that prayer offered in complete faith has power beyond what most people imagine possible. I lost my sword in the desert outside Damascus, stood defenseless before enemies who should have killed me, and discovered that prayer was not merely preparation for action, but could be action itself. Not merely words spoken into emptiness, but communication with a God who heard and responded and intervened in physical reality. This was my calling, not to abandon faith for weapons, but to abandon weapons for faith, to trust so completely in divine protection that I needed no other defense, to prove through my own life that the God we claim to serve is real and present and powerful enough to protect those who trust Him without reservation. I did not choose this path. It chose me, called me, demanded that I surrender every practical consideration and conventional wisdom and trust in something invisible, intangible, impossible by worldly standards. And in surrendering, in trusting, in praying when every instinct screamed at me to fight, I discovered truth that most warriors never learn, that God is not merely an idea we speak of in churches, but a living presence who acts in the world, who responds to faith, who protects those who trust Him completely even when that trust looks like madness to everyone watching. My legacy is not battles won or enemies killed, but pilgrims protected, a village kept safe, a demonstration that prayer is not weakness but power, that faith is not retreat from action but the highest form of action, available to those who believe God is real. I lost my sword and fought with prayer alone, and in fighting this way I discovered what devotion truly means. Not the comfortable faith that asks God to bless our efforts while we rely on our own strength, but the radical faith that sets aside our strength entirely and relies on His alone. This is harder than warfare, more demanding than any battle because it requires us to surrender control, to trust what we cannot see, to act in ways that make no practical sense. to stand defenseless when every survival instinct screams at us to defend ourselves. But it is also truer than warfare, more honest about what we really believe, more aligned with the God we claim to serve. I was a devout Templar knight who lost his sword and discovered that prayer was the only weapon I would ever need. That discovery has defined every day of the last 30 years, has shaped who I became, has proven to me beyond any doubt that the God we worship is not distant or disinterested but intimately involved in our lives, hearing our prayers, responding to our faith, protecting those who trust him completely. Non nobis, Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to thy name give glory. These words mean everything to me now because I have learned through hard experience that glory belongs to God alone, that our strength accomplishes nothing except when surrendered to his purposes. That prayer is not merely religious exercise but power available to those who believe enough to set aside every other defense and trust him alone. I lost my sword. I fought with prayer, and I discovered that God is real in ways I had never understood when I trusted in weapons more than words. When I believed devotion meant carrying both sword and rosary, rather than choosing rosary alone. This is my testimony, my legacy, my gift to those who come after. That faith is real, that prayer has power, that God protects those who trust him completely even when trust seems like madness. Believe it or doubt it as you will. I can only tell you what I have witnessed, what I have experienced, what I know to be true beyond any argument or evidence, that I stood defenseless and prayed, and God answered. And that answer changed everything I believed about what is possible when we trust him without reservation.